Good morning, welcome back. Last week we ended saying that we won't get a Christian society until most of us become fully Christian. So this week we're actually going to jump into about, let's say, getting the Christian specifications for running the human machine. Now, I'm going to run through chapter 4 pretty quick because we're going to spend most of today talking about chapters 5 and 6. So before we get into the actual specifications on morality, Lewis wants to make 2 points. So, chapter 4, morality and psychoanalysis. The first point is that morality claims to be putting the human machine right. And so he wants to talk about something else that claims to do the same thing, which is psychoanalysis. Lewis says, when you make a moral choice, there are 2 things involved. The first is the actual choice that you make, the decision, but then the other thing is the impulses that you're presented with. We talked a while back about if you saw a drowning man, you would probably have 2 instincts kicked in. One to help him, and the other to keep yourself safe.
What about taking pictures?
Taking pictures.
It was written before they had cell phones.
Yeah.
So you have the actual choosing, and then you have what Lewis calls the raw material that you're presented with, the impulses in your nature. Now, these impulses can be normal, or they can be abnormal. A normal instinct would be the fear a man has of danger if he's going into a war. An abnormal would be an irrational fear of spiders or dogs. Now, the job of psychoanalysis is to fix the raw material. Lewis says, imagine 3 men go to war. The first has an ordinary natural fear of danger that any man has and subdues it by a moral effort and becomes a brave man. Let us suppose that the other 2 have, as a result of things in their subconscious, exaggerated, irrational fears, which no amount of moral effort can do anything about. Now suppose that a psychoanalyst comes and cures these 2. That is, he puts them both back in the position of the first man. Well, it is just then that the psychoanalytical problem is over and the moral problem begins. Because, now that they are cured, these 2 men might take quite different lines. The first might say, thank goodness I've got rid of all those doodahs. Now at last I can do what I always wanted to, my duty to my country. But the other man might say, well, I'm very glad that I now feel moderately cool under fire, but, of course, that doesn't alter the fact that I'm still jolly well determined to look after number 1, and let the other chap do the dangerous job whenever I can. Now this difference is a purely moral one, and psychoanalysis cannot do anything about it. However much you improve the man's raw material, you have still got something else, the real, free choice of the man on the material presented to him, either to put his own advantage first or to put it last. And this free choice is the only thing that morality is concerned with. Lewis goes on to say that your bad material is not a sin, but a disease. It does not need to be repented of, but it should be cured. And this is why we're told not to judge. We judge by action or by results. God judges by what we've done with our material. It may be that when a cruel, twisted person does some small kindness, or even refrains from a cruelty they would have normally done, that is more of a victory in God's eyes than if we were to lay down our life. Some of us nice people put our good health and upbringing to so little good that really we're worse than those we might call fiends. How would you behave, Lewis asks, if you had terrible biology and upbringing? God does not judge him on the raw material at all, but on what he has done with it. Most of the man's psychological makeup is probably due to his body. When his body dies, all that will fall off him. And the real, central man, the thing that chose, that made the best or worst of this material, will stand naked. All sorts of nice things which we thought our own, but were really due to a good digestion, will fall off some of us. All sorts of nasty things which were due to complexes or bad health will fall off others. We shall then, for the first time, see everyone as he really was. There will be surprises. Which brings us to Lewis's second point. Lots of people like to think of morality as a sort of bargain with God, where God says, if you keep this set of rules, I'll reward you. And if you don't, I'll do the other thing. Lewis says, I don't think this is the right way to look at it. Lewis says, I think a better way to look at it is that every time you make a choice, it changes the inside, central part of your soul a little bit, turning you slowly, every day, into a heavenly or hellish creature. This is what confused Lewis about the early Christian writers initially. They seemed to be so strict one moment and so free and easy the next. They would talk about sins of the thought as being critically important. If you hate a man, then you've murdered him in your heart. But then the next, they'd talk about these terrible murders and betrayals as if all you need to do is repent and all would be well. What it is that they're always thinking of those little marks on the soul. There's lots more in that chapter, but we're going to keep chugging right along. So with that, we're going to jump into chapter 5 on sexual morality. And the first thing we need to do is get clear that we're not to confuse the societal rule of modesty with the Christian virtue of chastity, which is your sexual behavior. Now, Lewis uses an image of, let's say 500 years ago, a Pacific Island girl in nothing but a grass skirt versus a 500 years ago Victorian lady all done up in frills and fluffs. Now, these are two very different rules in terms of modesty, because modesty is the rule of what clothes you can wear or how much of your body you can show. Now, if you break the rule of modesty, it may or may not be a sin against chastity. If you break modesty in order to excite lust in yourself or others, then you are being unchaste. If you break it out of ignorance, then you're only guilty of bad manners. However, if you break it in order to shock or embarrass others, you're not being unchaste, but you are being uncharitable, because it's not charitable to take pleasure in other people's discomfort. The next point to make is that a high level of modesty, let's say the Victorian lady, a high standard of modesty does not equal a high standard of chastity. Okay? The Pacific Island girl and the Victorian lady might both be equally modest or immodest. And for all we know, they might be equally chaste or unchaste, because that has to do with their behavior. Finally, Lewis says this is terribly inconvenient because in the modern age, different ages of people have different standards. He says, I think the best thing we can do is for old-fashioned people to try to not see the younger people as being just corrupt all the way through. And for the younger people to have a little bit of grace and not call the older-fashioned people prudes for not adopting the new standard. Now, to actually begin, Lewis says, chastity is the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. There's no getting away from it. The Christian rule is either marriage with complete faithfulness to your partner, or else total abstinence. Now, this is so difficult and contrary to our sexual instinct, as it is now, that obviously either Christianity is wrong or our sexual instinct has gone wrong. One or the other. Of course, being a Christian, I think it is the instinct which has gone wrong. But Lewis says he has other reasons for thinking so. Right? The biological purpose of sex is reproduction. Just like the biological function of eating is to, let's say, power and repair your body. Now, you have a biological impulse to eat. If you were to eat every time you wanted to, and as much as you wanted to, you would probably eat too much. That is, your appetite goes a little beyond the biological need, but not too much. You might eat enough for 2 people, but not enough for 10. On the flip side, if a young man indulged his sexual appetite every time it arose, and each one of those encounters produced an offspring, then in a few years he could father a small town. In this case, the appetite is in ludicrous excess to its function. Here's another reason that Lewis thinks that it's gone wrong. We have, or Lewis had, and in our society it's gotten worse, but Lewis is going to talk about the striptease. Lewis says, imagine a country that has a food tease, where you could fill a theater and get people to pay through the nose to come see someone carry out on stage a covered plate. And the suspense rises and the music crescendos right before he takes the plate off, and right before the lights cut out, you could see a well-done steak. What would you think of a country like that? One critic wrote to Lewis and says, if I heard of such a country where a food tease existed, my first conclusion that the people would be starving. And Lewis actually agrees. That is a very good hypothesis. But the next step is to test it. Are the people in that country starving? Are the people in Lewis's time with the sex tease, with the strip tease, being sexually starved? Lewis says no. Birth control has made sex safer and easier than it has ever been. And public opinion towards extramarital sex is far less hostile than it's ever been. Lewis says it's important to remember that both starving people and people who are gorged think about food a lot. The famished and the gluttons both like titillations. Third, you find very few people who want to eat things that are not food, or to do things with food other than eating it. But perversions of the sexual instinct are numerous, hard to cure, and frightful. Lewis says, I am sorry to have to go into all these details, but I must. The reason why I must is that you and I, for the last 20 years, have been fed all day long on good, solid lies about sex. We have been told, until one is sick of hearing it, that sexual desire is in the same state as any of our other natural desires, and that if we were only to abandon that silly old Victorian idea of hushing it up, everything will be lovely. It is not true. The moment you look at the facts and away from the propaganda, you see that it is not. They tell you sex has become a mess because it was hushed up. But for the last 20 years, it has not been. It has been chattered about all day long. Yet, it is still a mess. If hushing up had been the cause of the trouble, ventilation would have set it right. But it is not. I think it is the other way round. I think the human race originally hushed it up because it had become such a mess. Modern people like to say that sex is nothing to be ashamed of. And when they say this, they may mean two things. First, they may mean that human beings reproduce in a certain way, and that this way gives pleasure. If that's what they mean, then Christianity agrees. Christianity is almost the only one of the great religions which thoroughly approves of the body, which believes that matter is good, that God himself once took on a human body, and that some kind of body is going to be given to us even in heaven, and is going to be an essential part of our happiness, our beauty, and our energy. But when people say sex is nothing to be ashamed of, what they usually mean is the state that sex is in now is nothing to be ashamed of. Lewis disagrees. There's nothing shameful in enjoying your food. There would be shame if everyone made food the center of their life and spent all their time going around smacking their lips and drooling. Lewis says, I do not say that you and I are individually responsible for the present situation. Our ancestors have handed over to us organisms which are warped in this respect, and we grow up surrounded by propaganda in favor of unchastity. There are people who want to keep our sex instinct inflamed in order to make money out of us, because, of course, a man with an obsession is a man who has very little sales resistance. God knows our situation. He will not judge us as if we had no difficulties to overcome. What matters is the sincerity and perseverance of our will to overcome them. But before we can be cured, we have to want to be cured. And most of us struggle to even want the cure. Lewis tells a story about an early Christian writer, but he doesn't credit him, and so I wasn't able to find out who this is, but credits someone who used to pray, Lord, make me chaste. Every day he would pray, Lord, make me chaste. And it wasn't until years later that he looked back and realized that he was adding in his heart, oh, please, not just yet, though. Lewis says there's two obstacles to us wanting the cure. The first is that the society we are in and the devils in our head say that it's all healthy and natural. And, like all good lies, it's built on a truth. Sex is healthy and natural. The lie is that any desire that should arise in us should be fulfilled. Even apart from Christianity, this is nonsense. Surrender to all your desires doesn't lead to happiness, but to disease, unhealth, and estrangement from others. But the second obstacle to us wanting the cure is that many people don't try because they think the attempt is impossible. I can't succeed. It's such an impossible standard to aspire to. Why even try? Lewis then goes on to give an analogy of a test. If you come across an extra credit question, you can think about whether you know the answer before you try to answer it. Given a mandatory question, you have to do the best you can. You may get a few points for a bad answer. You will certainly get none for leaving it blank. This is a mandatory question. And I'll repeat what I read earlier. God knows our situation. He will not judge us as if we had no difficulties to overcome. What matters is the sincerity and perseverance of our will to overcome them. Finally, Lewis says it's important to note that this is not the center of Christian morality. Lots of people like to think it is, and lots of people strongly object to the Christian standard of sex. And there are even people who think that the fall in the Garden of Eden had something to do with sex. But Lewis says it's wrong to think that unchastity is the supreme vice. He says sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least kind of bad. Right? The worst sins are the sins that are of pure spirit, of putting others down, of bossing people around or patronizing them, the pleasures you get out of power or hatred. There are two things, Lewis says, inside me, competing with the human self which I must try to become. They are the animal self and the diabolical self. The diabolical self is the worst of the two. That is why a cold, self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. But, of course, it is better to be neither. Now, that chapter was mainly negative. And so now we're going to go into chapter 6 on Christian marriage, which is talking about sex in its right, in its positive manifestation. And Lewis starts out saying, this is not something I want to talk about. For the first reason, when he wrote this or gave these speeches, he was not married. He was a bachelor until late in life. And the second reason is that the Christian doctrines on this are incredibly unpopular. But, he says, they can't be left out of an attempt to give an adequate description of Christian morality. The Christian idea of marriage is based on Christ's words that a man and wife are to be regarded as a single organism. For that is what the words one flesh would be in modern English. And the Christians believe that when he said this, he was not expressing a sentiment, but stating a fact. Just as one is stating a fact when one says that a lock and its key are one mechanism, or that a violin and a bow are one musical instrument. Now I want to stop and dwell on that for just a moment, because in our scientific modern world, the idea of two people being one organism kind of pushes back against us because we perceive them as obviously two organisms, like they're definitely discrete. And so Lewis says it has more to do with not object mutuality, they're mutually two people, but with function. In what sense is a violin an instrument without its bow? In what sense is a bow an instrument without its violin? They are only an instrument when they come together. The inventor of the human machine was telling us that its two halves, the male and the female, were made to be combined together in pairs, not simply on the sexual level, but totally combined. The monstrosity of sexual intercourse outside marriage is that those who indulge in it are trying to isolate one kind of union, the sexual, from all the other kinds of union, which were intended to go along with it. Excuse me. The Christian attitude does not mean that there is anything wrong about sexual pleasure, any more than about the pleasure of eating. It means you must not try to isolate that pleasure and try to get it by itself, any more than you ought to try to get the pleasure of taste without swallowing and digesting, by chewing things and spitting them out again. As a consequence, Christianity teaches that marriage is for life. Now, different church denominations disagree as to how stringent we should be on divorce laws. Some say that it should never be allowed, and some say that you can allow it in extreme cases. And in this way, it is kind of like a very severe invasive surgery. Some people think the surgery is so dangerous it cannot be done at all, and others think it can be done in the worst kind of emergency. What all churches should agree on is that it's more like cutting off both your legs than it is like dissolving a business partnership, or even deserting a regiment. Before we can get to marriage and divorce in regards to chastity, we first have to talk about it in regards to another virtue, namely justice. When you get married, you make marriage vows. That is, you made a promise, and you drew up a marriage license, a contract. Now, some people might say that it was merely a formality. They never intended to keep it. Lewis asks, who then were you trying to deceive? God? That's not very wise. Yourself? That's not much wiser. Your fiancé or the in-laws? That was treacherous. Lewis says, I think most people want to deceive the public. They want the respectability of marriage without having to pay the price. That is, they were imposters. They cheated. If they are still contended cheats, I have nothing more to say to them. Who would urge the high and hard duty of chastity on people who have not yet wished to be merely honest? If they have now come to their senses and want to be honest, their promise, already made, constrains them. And this, you will see, comes under the heading of justice, not that of chastity. If people do not believe in permanent marriage, it is perhaps better that they should live together unmarried than that they should make vows they do not mean to keep. It is true that by living together without marriage, they will be guilty in Christian eyes of fornication, but one fault is not mended by adding another. Unchastity is not improved by adding perjury. Now, the modern idea of being in love as the only reason for marriage really leaves no room for the idea of marriage as a contract. Yet the odd thing is, those who are in love universally tend to bind themselves together. Love songs all throughout history are sung with promises of eternal constancy, of excluding all others. So in this sense, Christianity is not introducing anything foreign to love. It's insisting that people take seriously what love already compels them to do. And of course, the promise, made when I am in love and because I am in love, to be true to the beloved as long as I live, commits me to being true even if I cease to be in love. A promise must be about things that I can do, about actions. No one can promise to go on feeling in a certain way. He might as well promise to never have a headache, or to always feel hungry. But what, it may be asked, is the use of keeping two people together if they are no longer in love? There are several sound social reasons: to provide a home for their children, to protect the woman, who has probably sacrificed or damaged her own career by getting married, from being dropped whenever the man is tired of her. But there's a third reason, and Lewis finds it hard to properly articulate it, so we're going to slow down here and really be careful. First thing we want to get clear is people like to think of things in terms of good and bad, not necessarily in terms of good, better, and best, or bad, worse, and worst. Okay, so let's get that clear. What we call being in love is a glorious state, and, in several ways, good for us. It helps to make us generous and courageous. It opens our eyes not only to the beauty of the beloved, but to all beauty. No one in his senses would deny that being in love is far better than either common sensuality or cold self-centeredness. But, as I said before, the most dangerous thing you can do is take any one impulse and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. Being in love is a good thing, but it is not the best thing. There are many things below it, but there are also some things above it. It is a noble feeling, but it is still a feeling. Now, no feeling can be relied on to last in its full intensity, or even to last at all. Knowledge can last, principles can last, habits can last, but feelings come and go. If the old fairy tale ending, they lived happily ever after, is taken to mean they felt for the next 50 years exactly as they felt the day before they were married, then it says what probably never was nor ever would be true, and would be highly undesirable if it were. Who could bear to live in that excitement for even 5 years? What would become of your work, your appetite, your sleep, your friendships? Of course, ceasing to be in love does not necessarily mean ceasing to love. Books give the idea of being in love forever, and people find that when they're not in love forever, that entitles them to a change, not realizing that presently the joy will come out of the new thing as well. In love, as with everything else in life, thrills come at the beginning and don't last. A boy who goes flying for the first time is not going to experience the same thrills that he has when he really goes and joins the Air Force. The thrills of visiting some beautiful place are going to die out when you really go to live there. Does that mean that the boy shouldn't learn to fly, or that you shouldn't go and live in the beautiful place? Lewis says, if you go through with it, the dying away of the first thrill will be compensated for by a quieter and more lasting kind of interest. What is more, and I can hardly find the words to tell you how important I think this is, it is just the people who are ready to submit themselves to the loss of the thrill and settle down to the sober interest, who are then most likely to meet new thrills in some quite different direction. The man who has learned to fly and become a good pilot will suddenly discover music. The man who has settled down to live in the beauty spot will discover gardening. That is, I think, one little part of what Christ meant by saying that a thing will not really live unless it first dies. It is simply no good trying to keep any thrill. That is the very worst thing you can do. Let the thrill go. Let it die away. Go on through that period of death into the quieter interest and happiness that follows, and you will find you are living in a world of new thrills all the time. But if you decide to make thrills your regular diet and try to prolong them artificially, they will get weaker and weaker and fewer, and you will be a bored, disillusioned old man for the rest of your life. Now, we have a couple things to address here before we finish. The first is, Lewis addresses the question, should Christians vote to make it harder for everyone to get divorced? And this is a hard question. Lewis says a good rule of thumb is that we can't expect people who aren't Christians to lead Christian lives. It's already hard enough for those of us who are Christians to lead Christian lives. How can we expect people who aren't Christians to do so? And not only that, Lewis says, I know I'd be very upset if all the vegetarians got together and told me I couldn't eat meat. Lewis says, I think the best idea is that there needs to be two kinds of marriage. One that's governed by the state and applies to all her citizens, and the other that's governed by the church and is applicable to all her members. And the distinction needs to be quite sharp, so that at any moment you can tell the difference between the two and which one you're dealing with. Finally, and this is the most unpopular thing about the Christian idea of marriage, and that is the idea of wives submitting to their husbands, that husbands are the head. And there's two questions that this premise raises. The first, why need a head at all? Why not equality? And second, why should it be the man? We'll take these two questions in turn. The need for a head at all comes from the idea that marriage is for life. Let's suppose that a couple has a disagreement. What are they to do? Well, talk it over first, but let's assume they've already done that. Try to find a compromise. But let's suppose it's something that you can't actually compromise on. It's Boolean, it's binary, it's 1 or 0. There is actually no middle ground. What are they to do? Well, they can't vote, because in a party of two, there can be no majority. Either one of them has to have the final say, or they must part ways. And, since marriage is for life, one of them has to have the power of veto. Lewis says you can't have a permanent association without a constitution. Which leads us to the second question, why the man? And I'll read directly from Lewis for this. Well, firstly, is there any very serious wish that it should be the woman? As I have said, I am not married myself, but as far as I can see, even a woman who wants to be the head of her own house does not usually admire the same state of things when she finds it going on next door. She is much more likely to say, "Poor Mr. X. Why he allows that appalling woman to boss him about the way she does is more than I can imagine." I do not think she is even very flattered if anyone mentions the fact of her own headship. There must be something unnatural about the rule of wives over husbands, because the wives themselves are half ashamed of it and despise the husbands whom they rule. But there is also another reason, and here I speak quite frankly as a bachelor, because it is a reason you can see from the outside even better than from the inside. The relations of the family to the outer world, what might be called its foreign policy, must depend, in the last resort, upon the man, because he always ought to be, and usually is, much more just to the outsiders. A woman is primarily fighting for her own children and husband against the rest of the world. Naturally, almost rightly, their claims override for her all other claims. The function of the husband is to see that this natural preference of hers is not given its head. He has the last word in order to protect the other people from the intense family patriotism of the wife. If anyone doubts this, let me ask a simple question. If your dog has bitten the child next door, or if your child has hurt the dog next door, which would you sooner have to deal with? The master of that house or the mistress? Or, if you are a married woman, let me ask you this question. As much as you admire your husband, would you not say that one of his chief failings is his tendency not to stick up for his rights and yours against the neighbors as vigorously as you would like? A bit of a people pleaser? I am going to be very quiet for our discussion, since I am a married man and my wife is in the room. Next week, we'll be going into Chapter 7 on forgiveness, Chapter 8, the great sin, and Chapter 9, charity. But for now, that's all I have to say about that.